In order to pursue the death penalty, Mr. Zimmerman needed to portray Abu as a calculating, cold-blooded killer whose actions fit a pattern. In fact, Abu had killed a man before while in prison. So Mr. Zimmerman made up another story, which he told the mental health evaluators, a story he would tell again and again. Quote, "Further checking of court records reflect that the defendant was a leader of a prison gang attempting to gain control over the victim's gang, and that the murder was a cold-blooded, premeditated murder." End quote. Again, the facts tell another story.
There was such a contrast in what the DA's letter contained about Abu Ali in this earlier homicide that took place, for which he was found guilty of second degree. There was such an amazing contrast, portraying him as this gang leader who was bent on establishing his gang's superiority in the prison system, as opposed to him being a victim of homosexuality, and which is the real story.
That incident was painted by Mr. Zimmerman as being a drug turf war within the prison, and that was what he wrote to Dr. Marshall about, denigrating Mr. Jones' version of what had happened on that occasion.
The prosecutor made representations about the circumstances surrounding the 1972 case, characterizing it as a gang conflict, and in so characterizing it, attributing to Abu Ali attributes of intellectual functioning and leadership that simply did not exist.
In fact, all of that could have been verified, and ultimately has been in the post-conviction process. All of those facts have been established as true, the facts as explained by Abu Ali.
A man being raped in prison is as bad, is as horrible as a woman or anybody being raped out on the street, you know. And he wasn't just raped once, he was raped repeatedly.
It was a tragic spiral of violence that resulted from Abu Ali's being raped and assaulted, and to not present that to the folks who were making this evaluation and to mischaracterize what in fact had happened is deception. I don't think there's any other way you can talk about that.
To compound the misinformation about this 1972 offense, Mr. Zimmerman also told the mental health evaluators that, quote, "There appears to be no evidence from the records submitted to us in that proceeding that the defendant relied upon an insanity defense at trial," end quote. In fact, again, the opposite was true, as court records and correspondence from prison officials involved make clear.
And what Mr. Zimmerman did was just affirmatively misrepresent the history. He basically said there was no insanity evidence presented at this 1972 proceeding. There was no evidence of mental illness, and that's just not true. And he knows it wasn't true. It's not negligence. It's a misrepresentation.
There is strong physical evidence that Abu Ali did not commit the murder for which he's about to be executed. In fact, the only evidence that ties this man to the actual assault is the testimony of a co-defendant who made a deal for a lighter sentence in exchange for his story. Again, Abu Ali's lawyer did nothing to defend him.
We know, based on the clothing that was obtained from Abu Ali, that he had no blood on his clothing. And the state prosecutors recognized that the absence of blood on Abu Ali's clothing likely indicated that he was not the killer. And so you have physical evidence that suggests that Abu Ali is not the killer.
There's no way, given the description of how this happened, that James Jones could have been the one doing the stabbing, wearing the clothing described, and not have gotten any blood on it.
If they come back and told me there was no sign of his blood there, then I wouldn't have thought he'd have done it. Because there's going to be something there. I mean, common sense tells you that.
Having sat through that testimony, looked at those photographs, had we had the information about the blood splatter evidence, more particularly the lack of blood splatter evidence, we absolutely would have gone after that at trial.
Lionel Barrett was hired by Alan Boyd to defend Abu Ali. He was paid a $5,000 retainer and promised $10,000 more.
As we found out, he hadn't been paid, so he didn't do any work. As we found out, you know, Sumter Camp, his junior associate, sort of like Ron McNutt with me, Sumner Camp came to him a couple weeks before the trial, said, hey, we got this death penalty case coming up in a couple weeks. Don't you think we ought to get cranking on something, you know? And the first thing Lionel said is, well, have I been paid?
For whatever reason, Mr. Barrett never received the additional $10,000. Because of that, he did nothing to prepare for this capital case until the week before the trial began.
For reasons unknown to me, this case was not continued. And I say that because it was a rare case that we handled, particularly a case of any size or complexity, and certainly carrying this kind of penalty, that wasn't continued at least once. There was also no fact investigation done. None of the witnesses, factual witnesses, interviewed, the victim, the co-defendant, any of the other fact witnesses in the case. I think at one point I was asked what the theory of defense was in the case. There was not a theory of defense, as I understand that term, used.
At one point in the hearing, you know, when we were talking about Mr. Barrett's performance, the judge asked, you know, and I don't know if he was serious or not, but he asked, well, do you think that Mr. Barrett intentionally sabotaged the case? And I had never heard a judge say anything even remotely resembling that.
Furthermore, on the gentleman's behalf, I would tend to think that if someone that is defending a person is allowed to perform in the manner that Mr. Barrett did, then truly the legal system needs a bit of an overhaul.
That was the problem with Mr. Barrett. He didn't have any information. He hadn't done the investigation. He didn't have the witnesses. He didn't have the experts. And every court that's looked at this has agreed. There's no question that the defense attorney representing Abu Ali was grossly inadequate. He unconstitutionally failed to provide effective assistance. There's no dispute about that. The dispute about it is what it means. And in my judgment, it means that we're at risk of executing somebody who has been wrongly convicted of a crime for which he absolutely should and could not be sentenced to death.